Beautiful community, check. Cherry blossom Japanese tea with homemade hemp milk, check. Report by the Insider, 60 Minutes and Spiegel on potential Russian sonic weapons attacks on US personnel all over the world, check. So what's going to happen? I'm going to tell you a bit about this report that came out about 24 hours ago. And I'll introduce us to how we generally approach journalistic investigations like this, and we'll analyze it. But this will be a sort of civic exercise of sense-making rationality, or I'm sorry. I am sorry. Sense-making has become a horrible catchphrase for species of anti-institutional dogma on the internet. Forgive me about it. So basically we'll analyze it, read about 5 to 10% of it together, and try to figure out how, one responds to journalistic interventions like this and what they're all about. I think it'll be helpful, and we'll be here half an hour or so. So this is a year-long investigation by the Insider, Spiegel, and 60 Minutes, and it gives evidence toward Havana syndrome, horrible rapid onset symptoms and then chronic symptoms that US personnel all over the world, dozens upon dozens of them, have experienced. Gives evidence that this stuff is injury from directed energy weapons used by the GIU's infamous Unit 29155. And the report provides evidence about intercepted Russian intelligence documents, travel logs, call metadata, and eyewitness testimony. And all of this is supposed to push against the idea that previously obtained in the US intelligence community, that this is not very likely to be, this is very unlikely to be a foreign state attack. They give evidence about senior members of this JU unit getting awards for non-lethal acoustic weapons activity. And they give evidence about these JU folks traveling undercover and being geolocated to multiple locations around the world at the time of these anomalous health incidents, AHIs. And they also date this pattern of incidents to before Cuba 2016 to Frankfurt 2014. So what do we do when we first encounter a journalistic contribution like this? This is about 30 pages. I've printed it off from the Insider website, and the authors are Michael Weiss, Christo Grozev, and Roman Dobrokhotov. First of all, we check what the institutions are, and are they serious, some of them serious, all of them serious, who the authors are and what these authors have done before, right? And I think that is relatively easy to do for you guys, because you guys are well informed. You guys could name the major journalistic publications in most European countries, or certainly in the United States and in the UK. Now, there is sometimes a problem, just want to mention very quickly, that is genuinely hard for the responsible citizen, and I moan about it a lot. And the problem is that very often really big journalistic institutions combine releasing top quality sort of team journalistic enterprises that take a long time to build up with stuff that like a couple of 20-year-old kids written up in a weekend. That has much, much less journalistic rigor, and they release both, and you need to know what's what. And sometimes it's hard, unless you somehow have a way in or you're connected with the journalistic world. And I think that's often something that's unfair on citizens and inspires distrust of actually genuinely top-notch reporting. So, if the BBC releases something, I know if that's an 18-month enterprise with several journalists on it, a legal team, extraordinary gathering of testimony and cross-checking, very serious investigative arms extended to different countries, blah, blah, blah. Or it's something that was written for the BBC website by the youngest employees in a weekend. And I encourage journalistic institutions to be more careful about that lower-end production, because it undermines the perception of the higher-end production, without which democracies can't function. Last remark. This is not meant to be a social transaction that is like proof. We got it, guys. Conversation over. No. This is a really important journalistic contribution that says, look, guys, we feel we have a huge amount of evidence here, and we're putting it out into the culture. That doesn't settle the question. It means that there's a very compelling case, potentially, if these guys have done a good job. And then other journalists, various experts, and the US government come out and react, and then on that conversation goes. So the preciousness, the sacredness of a journalistic act like this isn't that it settles the question, it's that it moves the debate on in a very significant way and gets us closer to the truth. Now we're going to take off our conspiracy hat things now, because we're not in the realm of conspiratorial thought. Conspiratorial thought psychologically is about the notion that the truth that really matters is the truth that can't be known or can't be seen. But we're in the opposite mindset here, right? We are going to look at genuine evidence, going to reflect on how we adequately should react to it. And that is psychologically the very opposite of conspiratorial thought, right, in approach. So we're not gonna go nutty in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I have had a health incident myself in Havana because I ate chicken, but I didn't get attacked by magical Russian GIU waves. I walked into a joint in Havana in 2001 or so, and I said, "What's your menu?" And they said, "We don't have a written menu." So I said, "What is the menu then?" They said, "The menu is chicken, pork, or chicken and pork." I had chicken. And me and my travel companion were severely food poisoned and out of action. And that was just stale chicken. So, okay, enough small talk. Let's get serious. Joy, made up name, is an American nurse and the wife of a US embassy official. We're in October 2021 in Tbilisi, Georgia. And Joy is taking her laundry out of the dryer, where she was completely consumed by an acute ringing sound that reminded her of what someone in the movies experiences after a bomb goes off. It just pierced my ears, came into my left side, felt like it came through the window into my left ear. I immediately felt fullness in my head, a piercing headache, and then she ran out of the laundry room onto the second floor of the house, into the bathroom adjoining the master bedroom, and projectile vomited. And that sounds absolutely horrible, because you have no idea what is going on. But as we'll find out, she could observe some weird stuff through the security camera and out of the window. Let's jump around a bit and just read this. Unlike other teams, this is about this GIU team, within Russia's sprawling intelligence apparatus, this one doesn't spy on people, at least not for the sake of gathering information. It's devoted exclusively to so-called kinetic violent military operations. And a little bit on Havana syndrome before we circle back to Joy again. In terms of symptoms, we're talking chronic headaches, vertigo, tinnitus, No, I can't speak English, even though I've been here since 1994. Tinnitus, tinnitus, insomnia, nausea, lasting psychophysiological impairment, and in some cases blindness or hearing loss. Many victims have said they were fine 1 minute, then stricken with an intense pain or pressure in their skull the next, usually localized to one side of the head, as if they were caught in a beam of concentrated energy. So this sounds very concerning and disturbing. If this is indeed a replicating subjective account of this experience. Why is this experience happening to US personnel all over the world since 2014? What's going on? Others have suffered such severe long-term cognitive and vestibular after effects that they can no longer function on a day-to-day basis. They've been medically retired from government service. Back to Joy. Joy has suffered from headaches every day for the past 3 years. She's also undergone 2 surgeries for semicircular canal dehiscence, the appearance of holes in the bony walls that encase her inner ears. She will need a 3rd surgery to address the rapid deterioration of her temporal bone, a condition she says her neurosurgeon can't explain. So this is just a hell for Joy and a hell for the family. Well over 100 AHIs, these atypical health incidents, have been cited worldwide, affecting US diplomats, military officers, spies, contractors, and in some instances spouses, children, and even household pets. There is a reason why the Havana Act only came into force. We'll be back to Joy once more in a moment. There's a reason why the Havana Act only came into force in 2021. For the past 8 years, Havana syndrome has been the subject of intense controversy. Sociologists have suggested that it is little more than a mass psychogenic illness or perhaps a mass hysteria. Such arguments have been undercut by multiple medical studies, including one conducted by an expert panel convened by the US intelligence community. The final assessment of that investigation found that AHIs had a unique combination of core characteristics that can't be explained by known environmental or medical conditions and could be due to external stimuli. But the finding went on to say that it's very unlikely to be a product of a foreign adversary taking action against US personnel. And this assessment has sent shockwaves among the hundreds of former and current intelligence officers and their family members who believe they have suffered significant and often irreversible health consequences at the hands of a foreign force. As a result, many of these victims feel betrayed by their government for neglecting to identify the culprit for their predicament. There is a historical comparative example here of a very different kind, that is Gulf War syndrome. And Gulf War syndrome was also dismissed for a long time as not being real, until being much more formally recognized as indeed being a very serious, real, non-psychological illness to do with horrible exposure in the 1991 Gulf War. And I've been aware of the journey of some of these folks for a long time, because Gulf War syndrome, while it has a different trigger, is a very similar health condition. It acts differently, responds differently to different medicines, but it's a very similar health condition to myalgic encephalomyelitis. And these folks, Gulf War folks, were really seriously affected. And many of them were so neurologically ill they couldn't recognize their partners. So I'm aware of that story, and we're grateful for the recognition, but of course we always need more investigation and more research. And I've been many times to the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Miami, where some of this research was done. Back to Havana syndrome and Joy. Joy identified, or feels she identified, the guy. There was a black car parked outside. She could see it through the CCTV, and there was some guy there. And when she was shown a picture of that guy a couple of years later, she said, you can never be 100% sure with these things, but I have a very strong physiological reaction looking at this photo because it's him. Now, as someone reading this, my question is, I am inclined to take this very seriously, but at the same time, I do notice that there isn't an elaborate methodology for identification of this person outside the gates. That it doesn't look like Joy was given 30 photos and said, pick the one. It just looks like she was given a photo of the guy and asked, is that him? So that is something that I'm inclined to be persuaded about, but I recognize to be not very methodologically reliable. Joy's identification of Albert Avrianov outside her home in Tbilisi is backed up by 2 years government officials who told 60 Minutes that the Russian operative was indeed in the Georgian capital around the time of her attack. And they try to give various other kinds of evidence in this direction. And then they move on to Frankfurt. 2014. 7 years earlier, almost 2,000 miles to the west, in November 2014, in Frankfurt, 2 separate attacks occurred, one after the other, according to multiple sources. One of these sources, Mark Lenzi, is a current State Department official. Lenzi, his wife, son and daughter were all medevaced out of China in 2018 after they failed brain injury tests following some such similar event. And Lenzi says the 2014 Frankfurt attacks were always keen that they came before Cuba and China hits and should have received the most attention from the US government. One victim, who this investigation calls for its purposes Taylor, was apparently, according to Mark Lenzi, struck by similar symptoms. For Taylor, the symptoms began as an intense feeling of pressure, which started in the torso and radiated up to the head and neck, and then there was nausea, followed by high-pitched squeal, blah, 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 blah. So similar, substantively similar symptoms. And then via a third party, the Insider, 60 Minutes and Spiegel were able to share with Taylor 2 photographs of the culprit in his case, speculatively, allegedly, a guy called Gordienko, and Taylor did not hesitate in confirming that Gordienko was the suspect skulking around the US consulate housing. Yes, that's him, Taylor said. I'm getting goosebumps looking at him. And again, that looks to me like Taylor was shown a photo rather than many photos from which to pick out the culprit. I've skipped about 10 pages because I'm giving you a taste here rather than reliably summarizing the whole report. Of all the cases examined by the Insider et al., the most well documented involve U.S. intelligence and diplomatic personnel with subject matter expertise in Russia or operational expertise in countries such as Georgia and Ukraine, 2 post-Soviet states that have undergone pro-Western color revolutions in the past 2 decades. And what they go on to speculate about in the next pages is that this Western involvement and the Russian exaggerated perception of this Western involvement is a cause for some such action by the Russians. So they're speculating about motives here. And the reason that speculation is being made is in part because some of these attacks are kind of retrospective. They're attacks on people who were working on Russia stuff for the US government, but have then gone on to work for other stuff for the US government. So there's the speculation about motives of retrospective punishment here. I've jumped a few pages again. Pulsed microwave radiation is one of two technologies that scientists, including those assigned by US intelligence community to investigate the Havana syndrome, have theorized as the possible cause of the condition. The other is acoustic sound. Either of these approaches may result in the victim appearing to hear audible sounds, hums, and clicks. Russia has been experimenting with both for decades, and there is evidence of a promotion. There's a screenshot of a document about a prize given out for research on the potential capabilities of non-lethal acoustic weapons in combat activities in urban settings. And then there is a lengthy account of Operation Reductor, and Insider 60 Minutes Spiegel obtained a set of intelligence documents describing a classified Soviet-era program codenamed Reductor or Gearbox, began in 1984 at the Radiotechnical Measurement Research Institute in Kharkiv, Ukraine. Reductor's central task was to study the uses of electromagnetic radiation to influence the behavior and reactions of biological objects, including people. And then the historical derivatives and splits off from the original Reductor project is what they tried to trace in the next pages and say something about where such projects are at now. And then there is a quote from Dr. David Relman, who is a microbiologist at Stanford, who says that what this investigation says about Reductor aligns with what we and others have hypothesized, and thus recognized to be troubling implications. These kinds of injuries are caused by special forms of proposed to be caused by special forms of pulsed microwave energy, would not be expected to show up in brain imaging studies. These documents and their origins would appear to be very clearly worth pursuing. So it's a statement of scientific plausibility, but we'll later see that we might want more of those. A consensus has formed among the growing community of AHI sufferers that the US government, and the CIA in particular, is keen to hide the full extent of what it knows about Havana syndrome, and they speculatively make two moves here. First, that it might be uncomfortable to accept the implications that these Russian attacks are happening, and second, for recruitment purposes, it might be inconvenient. Then there is a reference to Mr. Patrushev, who is celebrating similar achievements to the sorts of things this investigation is about. A quote from Patrushev, 2023 September. In recent years, hundreds of employees of foreign intelligence services, as well as other persons involved in organizing intelligence and subversive activities against our country and our strategic partners, have been identified and neutralized. This is not the first time that US government personnel overseas have fallen victim to widespread adverse health consequences. In the decades since the Gulf War of 91-92, hundreds of thousands, of Western and Iraqi veterans reported suffering from a common set of symptoms ranging from fatigue to terminal tumors. As we've come to see. These have been a product of exposure to sarin. And then they say that, but unlike Gulf War syndrome, which resulted from a confluence of environmental factors rather than from the deliberate actions of a state actor, Havana syndrome shows all the markings of a Russian hybrid warfare operation. If it is established that the Kremlin really is behind these attacks, and the provision of healthcare and monetary compensation for the victims isn't enough to solve the problem, removing this many capable American diplomats and spies from active service without killing them and without your main adversary even admitting that they've done so, such a sustained decade-long campaign would easily count as a win for Putin, one of Putin's greatest strategic victories against the United States, if true. Let's analyze this. Is this good journalism? And of course, I'm going to link up the report below. Yes, it is. Now, you see, journalism is about putting this out there and seeing where it goes. Because as a journalist, you cannot know everything, right? And it's up to the US government, up to other experts, up to other journalists to react. So this is a healthy enterprise. And these folks do not overclaim their case. They say that this may well be true and there is strong evidence for it, and they try to give strong evidence. Again, the social transaction here, right, the social ritual involved is not, world, we've proven this. There's a lot of evidence here. Here is our investigation. We're putting it out into the world, and we hope that this will get us closer to the truth. A few remarks on sociogenic illness, and that's something I want to, for effective purposes, eliminate as a possibility, as a possible explanation of Havana syndrome. Now, I slightly disagree with the investigation in the lines when they claim that this has been chased away and debunked. It hasn't. There's plenty of talk about Havana syndrome being a psychosocial or a sociogenic illness. My view is that time after time, intellectually responsible psychiatrists and medical writers attach sociogenic illness labels to conditions they have no clue about, just no clue at all. And their latest blunder may well be Havana syndrome. And we should not get this muddled up. If we entirely dismiss the latest investigation hypothesizing a Russian link, we don't revert to it's sociogenic, but to we have no clue and we need to know more. And that go further. With my knowledge of various types of chronic illness and neurological illness, with the accounts given of the various US personnel who suffered this in different parts of the world, I don't see it as a mental illness. Of course, it's also worth adding that most of our models of sociogenic illness are laughable philosophically and need to be thrown out, and that impacts deeply the current practice of psychiatry and neurology. But that's a conversation for a separate occasion. I do not see significant reason to take the possibility that these folks are simply having some kind of psychosocial illness, some kind of psychically mediated event that then persists with chronic symptoms. I do not see that as, in this case, plausible. So that moves us to the realm of there is a disease at work, or there is an external stimulus at work that is not a disease, not triggered by a bug or a virus or some kind of mold or other exposure. and then further that this is a product of an attack by a foreign state, and that foreign state are the Russians. So we're dealing with that spectrum of possibilities. I'm fairly comfortable to put aside the sociogenic scenario. Now, what do I think of the witness testimony in this investigation? I find it compelling. First of all, because there are consistent and stable descriptions of symptoms across time, both within the experience of a single individual and between individuals experiencing this in different parts of the world. And these individuals aren't random. They have the added testimonial credibility of working for the State Department, of working for the US government, of working for US agencies. To an extent, the same goes for the identification of perpetrators. Here, I wasn't hugely methodologically pleased, but that identification of perpetrators, which appears in the investigation, should be given some credibility, some non-zero amount of credibility at the very least, especially because these are not random people reporting this, but they're people working for the US government. So what have we got? We've got a significant number of people all over the world working on Russia for the US government who've got sick in substantively similar ways at moments when there is evidence of GIU units being in geographical proximity to them. The case for this, not the case for the GIU being the ones who caused this, but the case for all of this being true is strong, overwhelmingly strong. In other words, significant number of people working for the US government on Russia, getting sick in similar ways, and at moments it being possible to trace GIU folks to nearby locations. That all looks very, very strong. Now, we have to move from that to saying the GIU folks caused this. And that is one of the things we need to reflect about in our response to the report. What are questions that could arise for us? Well, one question is, where is the evidence about UK or Ukrainian or Russian oppositional folks being targeted? Is that evidence unavailable because it's unavailable or because such attacks haven't happened? Much more trivially, we could ask questions about the attribution of motives to the Kremlin, especially in the case of retrospective attacks on people who no longer work on Russia. But having said this, I don't see this as a significant objection. And then we come to a very big question. The technical credibility of the entire story, which is such a big question because virtually nobody reading a journalistic investigation like this can be entirely qualified to have even minimal views about the technical feasibility of this stuff that's being talked about. And so I suppose the responsible citizen on the armchair in the sofa reading this at home with a cup of coffee is, what should I think about the possibility of 8 experts coming out next week and saying that the technological possibilities attributed to Russia are impossible, either because they are impossible in practice or they are impossible given the capacities of the Russians or something else? How do I know that that's not going to happen? What are my reasons to not expect that to happen? Now, I do think the investigation addresses that to some extent, but that has got to remain a significant and central question. As well as the question about more direct evidence that the Russians are using these technologies and that they've got them functioning and that they are operationalized around the world. There is evidence toward this in this investigation. But the question is, what if I want more evidence? And what if I want reassurance that the evidence given isn't going to be contradicted by experts with understanding of this technology, a technology, the viability of which I cannot as a layperson assess. So that's just worth raising and putting out there, and I do think that's a reasonable question which the journalists themselves would accept. My conclusion: Havana syndrome is a non-sociogenic biological injury. The evidence in the investigation that we've looked at is circumstantial, but it is extensive and it is thorough. And as a piece of journalism, I am very impressed with it. And I have to say, I am unimpressed with some colleagues, some colleagues, they're not colleagues. I'm not a Russia expert. I'm a political philosopher whose expertise is to comment on the world as a political philosopher, and I comment on Russia a great deal of the time. But plenty of experts said, "No, I don't buy this. This is a mental or a physical illness." But these people wouldn't know a mental illness or a physical illness if it hit them in the face, in terms of the complex range of possibilities, how these things work, the clinical history of all these things. They don't know anything about how human mental illness and human physical illness works. Maybe some experience with their mates. So these claims are much weaker than the reflective standard this investigation successfully meets. So while I rule out effectively a sociogenic cause, we're somewhere between injury as the result of disease, as the result of a non-disease external intervention, as the result of foreign state intervention, as a result of intervention by the Russians. And in particular, giving allowance for layperson agnosticism about what is technologically viable in principle and in practice, giving that aside and allowing us the space to alter our position if new public contributions and clarifications about this become available, allowing for this qualification, I think the case made in this investigation is strong. And I take it very seriously, indeed. Lots of love and thank you for being with me.